Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football, breaking down the top 5 players at each position in as many conferences as we can get to. We've got Ryan Cantor from Shaking the Southland to help us look at the wide receiver position in the ACC, which has been, thanks mostly to Clemson, been loaded in recent years. But if you take into consideration only 4 players at that position drafted to the NFL, and all of them, Deion Kane, Ray McLeod, Braxton Berrios, and Auden Tate, from 3 teams and all drafted in the 6th and 7th rounds, there should be a whole lot of talent coming back to conference play. So, Ryan, we appreciate you jumping on board as always and would love to hear your top 5 returning wide receivers in the ACC.
Yeah, so with so few guys leaving, wide receivers stacked in the ACC this year. So I'll run down my top 5. There's a couple honorable mentions we could circle back to because they definitely deserve mention. So number 5, Naquan or Nooney Murray from Florida State. Number 4, rising sophomore T. Higgins from Clemson. Number 3, Jalen Smith of Louisville. Number 2, Kelvin Harmon of NC State had really impressive stats last year and will have the number 1 quarterback in the ACC throwing to him. And number 1, a wide receiver, a slot receiver from Wake Forest, Greg Dortch. And as weird as that sounds, it's almost a no-brainer.
Yeah, so it's interesting here. So I'm checking off the guys that you just mentioned, and my initial thoughts are Kelvin Harmon came out as a pretty unheralded wide receiver. I remember his recruitment for a few different reasons, but he was barely in the top 100 wide receivers in the nation coming out of high school, but has put together 2 pretty productive seasons in 16 and 17, 51 catches and 4 touchdowns this past season. T. Higgins intrigues me. I think he's going to be a breakout player. We've talked about him for the last few years, ever since he was recruited by Dabo Swinney and staff. This past season, though, he did catch 17 for 345 and 2 touchdowns. So the thing that jumps out is obviously the per catch reception rate is off the charts, over 20 yards per reception. But basically, he did little until the Citadel game. So the competition there, underwhelming, but then did have some big plays against South Carolina with 3 catches and 84 yards in the finale. Nooney Murray obviously suffered from the issues with at the quarterback position for Florida State. James Blackman, a freshman, taking charge of the job after DeAndre Francois was knocked out of the opener. Certainly his stats had to suffer from those circumstances, but still caught 40 passes for 4 touchdowns. And what I remember him best for to date in his collegiate career has been the huge Orange Bowl game he had against Michigan the previous season, which capped off a top 10 campaign for Florida State. And he scored the game-winning touchdown against the Wolverines in a 1-point win. Greg Dortch, Wake Forest. What's the secret of Wake Forest football in recent years has been a plodding, running style team that always had an awful offensive line and no explosiveness, has suddenly found playmakers at the wide receiver position. Wake Forest actually finished the season as one of the top 15 best offenses in pass efficiency and scored like 50 points a game or in the bowl game against Texas A&M. And Greg Dortch, one of the big reasons why, with 9 touchdown receptions, although they lose their quarterback in John Wolford coming into this season. And I'm just a little bit curious, Ryan, when you look at the wide receiver position, it's obviously affected by the quarterback play and by extension, the offensive line, and also the philosophy on offense in terms of run-pass ratio. So how much are you projecting just sheer statistics as being the impetus for your top 5, or are you taking other things into consideration?
I'm kind of doing a blend. I think it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to do it purely on who's the best without any evidence. I mean, we could go pick some Georgia Tech wide receivers who might be good if they ever pass the ball, but it's sort of irrelevant. But I also somewhat penalized guys like Jalen Smith, who had Lamar Jackson throwing to him. So he had 908 yards, 7 touchdowns. He's fantastic, but he also had the best quarterback in the conference throwing to him last year. So we'll see how he does with Juwan Pass. So that kind of puts him outside the top 2. For Greg Dortch, they're going to be a lot more run focused this year. They lose John Wolford, to your point, who I think is probably the most underrated quarterback the ACC's had in a while. He was excellent last year as a senior, 4-year starter. So that's definitely a risk for Dortch. But as I looked more and more into Dortch, I was pretty blown away. His 722 yards and 9 touchdowns. It's only in 8 games. The last game he played was against Louisville prior to his injury. He had 5 touchdowns, 5 receiving touchdowns that broke the record. And he comes back. He's only going to be a redshirt sophomore. So that's just incredible. Kelvin Harmon, he was great last year, but NC State loses a lot of talent around him. So he's going to be more heavily relied upon. They lose Hines, the 1,000-yard rusher. They lose Jalen Samuels, their defensive end, tight end, and they lose seemingly everyone on defense. So they're going to have to air the ball out a little bit. So I think Kelvin Harmon's in for a big year. We talked about T. Higgins. His upside's incredible. He was really just coming on towards the end of the year against the Citadel in South Carolina. And then he was supposed to have a big role against Alabama, but he got yanked down in a pass interference call and ended up getting hurt. Really changed the complexion of that game. And I strongly agree with what you were saying about Nooney Murray. He had a pretty good year, but that was the 12th best passing offense in the ACC by yardage. So you almost have to handicap him a little bit. To your point, he didn't have great quarterback play. Not necessarily that Blackman isn't a good quarterback, but wasn't necessarily ready. They don't have very many other options at wide receiver. They'll have even fewer this year with Auden Tate gone. So what he did was particularly impressive, and I think now is the undisputed number 1 option with more stability and probably a better culture there now. I think he's a really impressive player. One note is he did injure his knee in spring, so he could have been higher on the list. He was actually a notch or 2 higher, but he hurt his knee, so that negatively impacts him.
We're breaking down the top 5 wide receivers in the ACC and going beyond that with Ryan Cantor from Shaking the Southland, of course, the SB Nation platform for Clemson athletics. Des Fitzpatrick was just a top 53 wide receiver, according to 247 Sports, but as a freshman caught 37 passes for Louisville and 5 touchdowns out of Indiana, so he may take that next step of development after a freshman campaign that was pretty solid. TJ Rahming comes into his senior campaign for Duke, and he's been extremely consistent out of the slot. He's caught 43, then 70 as a sophomore, dropped back to 47 receptions last year with Daniel Jones at quarterback. Stability at that position. TJ Rahming may finish out his career at Duke with a nice season, but only 4 total touchdowns. So a lot of plays within the 20s, but not scoring for TJ Rahming, but one of the most prolific wide receivers in terms of receptions in recent memory in the ACC and in Duke history. Olamide Zaccheaus, another player who's going to be dependent on the quarterback position, of course, and considering that they lose Kurt Benkert, who has been will be in an NFL camp this year. Zaccheaus, 62 catches and 4 touchdowns for the Virginia Cavaliers as they try to get back to postseason play next year. Go to Miami. Ryan, you mentioned Ahmmon Richards, who burst onto the scene, was an ACC all-freshman player with 49 catches 2 years ago, hobbled with injuries last year, only caught 24 passes and 3 touchdowns. On the opposite side, Jeff Thomas, a guy that burned defenses when he had the opportunity, like T. Higgins, 17 catches, but over 340 yards, meaning more than 20 yards per reception. He actually had 374 and 2 touchdowns. So now talking about a number of guys that aren't necessarily going to garnish top 5 votes, but considering they're early in their careers, they play on prolific offenses, most of them, and they're early in their development, could really take that next step and be 50, 60 catch guys here in 2018. And I'll add to that list Kobe White out of Boston College. So they don't throw it around too well, but at the same time, I'm hearing that based on A.J. Dillon coming back, they've got a starting quarterback back in A.J. Brown and a decent offensive line with 4 starters returning, that Boston College will probably field its best offense. And this isn't saying a whole lot, but still best offense in 6 years under Steve Adazio.
Yeah, Anthony Brown and Boston College should have their best offense. I definitely agree. That's a really good team that won't get the credit they deserve because their schedule is just so hard. We've talked about this before, but their cross rivalry and the rotating cross coastal opponent is unfairly hard this year. They'll get both Virginia Tech and Miami, and then they're in the Atlantic, so they have to play Florida State and Clemson. Pretty tough road for them to hoe there. They could go 8-4 and be very good. One note I want to correct myself on: Greg Dortch against Louisville, it was 4 touchdown passes. That was their Wake Forest school record, not 5. But I'll add a note on that is Wake Forest led the ACC in passing touchdowns with 33. He had 9 of those, so incredible. One guy we haven't mentioned that it would just be wrong for us to not mention is Hunter Renfrow. 60 catches. I'm just going to assume you saved him for me because it's the right thing to do. 602 yards. Get this. In the ACC games last year, he caught 32 out of the 32 catchable balls thrown to him. He has the best hands in the conference. He may not have the deep ball. He may not be the deep ball threat that some of these guys are, but he's not just a steady Eddie. He is an excellent slot receiver. If not for Greg Dortch, he'd be the best slot receiver in the conference. He's a fantastic receiver. I really debated him in the 5 and the 4 slot with Murray and Higgins. Another guy we didn't mention was Anthony Ratcliffe Williams, 630 yards, 6 touchdowns, but also a great kick returner. So wasn't sure how to weigh that, but he was definitely in consideration. So those 2 guys, definitely excellent players. Don't want to give them the short end of the stick here.
Hunter Renfrow, the only player in the conference who did not drop a pass, according to Pro Football Focus last season. He's caught 137 in his stellar career at Clemson, including a lot of ones that count for big plays in a championship run and elite run for the Clemson Tigers. I'm going to mention as well out of Virginia Tech, Eric Kuma, who caught 28 last year. And again, the stats aren't going to blow you away, but consider early in the career development, may break out to be a 45 or 50 or 60 catch guy this season. Had his best game in the bowl game against the decent Oklahoma State defense, 5 catches for 72 and 1 touchdown. So scads of players that have an opportunity to take that next step that were on the field and caught some balls and did some good things last season, not necessarily stars, but could be here in 2018. All right, Ryan Cantor from Shaking the Southland, SB Nation platform for Clemson Athletics, joining us to break down the top 5 wide receivers in the ACC. Ryan, we always appreciate it.
Thank you.